My name is Paul Jacobs, and I want to speak with Mr. John Harris in the Public Information Office. And in your letter, you say that, and this is what sort of confuses me.
This is a film about a reporter and a story he's covered for 20 years.
The free world must have armed strength. The free world must have it now, not in reserve, not later, but now. We must have men, ships, planes, tanks, and bombs on hand, ready for any emergency. And if we have them, we won't have to use them.
The story begins with the discovery of the atom bomb and continues with the Cold War and the series of nuclear tests in the desert, 65 miles north of Las Vegas, Nevada. It involves national security and governmental secrecy and the exposure of hundreds of thousands of Americans to atomic radiation. Paul Jacobs was one of the first to investigate the story.
In 1957, Linus Pauling told me that he thought there was an interesting story out in Nevada involving the people who lived in the area around the test site and who were being exposed by the Atomic Energy Commission to fallout from the bomb tests that were being run out there. He asked me if I would go out and investigate the story.
As this thriving community went about its business, youngsters on their way to school, housewives starting on the chores of the day, merchants opening their doors, and the folks at home listening to the radio program.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this program to bring you important news. Word has just been received from the Atomic Energy Commission that due to a change in wind direction, the residue from this morning's atomic detonation is drifting in the direction of St. George. It is suggested that everyone remain indoors for 1 hour or until further notice. There is no danger.
It was the day that heavy wind blew from Vegas, and they had announced that people were not to go outside. But I hadn't heard it on the radio, and after my family left for school, I went outside that morning to put some bulbs in the ground and on the west side of my house so the sun wouldn't be on me when it got warmer. And I worked there about a half hour, and I started feeling so faint that I could scarcely stand up, and decided I'd better go in the house, and I could hardly get in. I was so dizzy and faint that I could hardly make it into the house, and I went in and laid down on the bed. And I was there for a while. I just felt as if I didn't want to ever get up again.
My husband was a very rugged individual, and this particular time he was down south of town in the Virgin Gorge when he heard the blast go off in the Las Vegas area. And soon after that, this big cloud of dust went over.
It came up a little snowstorm, just a March spring snowstorm, And when the snow fell onto the ground, it wasn't white. It was the color of this cloud. It was a type of dark gray. So I got off my horse and examined it again, and it burned my fingers. So then I went on over to a reservoir and washed my fingers, and they ceased to burn. But there's no question in my mind that what it was, some of that fallout that remained in the area.
And I visited a family where a woman had lost all the hair on her head, and she said that that was a result of being caught in a cloud where one of the tests had come, and she'd been out working in her orchard, and no one had warned her that the cloud was going to come. And I saw a family where they lost a couple of children to leukemia, and where they were convinced it was as a result of the tests. And I saw sheep and dogs that looked as if they might have been affected by the tests.
This is now 20 or 25 years, I'm not good at figures, later, but so many cases of cancer have developed right around me.
When did you develop cancer?
It must have been in the early 70s, 1970.
How many people in your own immediate neighborhood did you say?
About
have
12
cancer? Have cancer.
have had it or have died from it. I had lost a 16-year-old niece just not long before my husband died that had leukemia, and several friends that I knew personally, and then a good many that I just heard of. Right. Max, would you like to join me? Max, my friend who got bit with the same bug.
Oh, I didn't know that. You got leukemia?
Yeah.
I didn't know. When did you find out?
Oh, it's 3 years ago now. It's when I first went to the doctor, and he said, sent the blood test in, and said that's when what I had.
Were you exposed to the radiation?
Yeah, I was herding sheep out here on the Arizona Strip, just south of town. And was there every year as they had the blast, and I don't know whether it was due to that or what it was, but the cloud went up across, and all the friends in Fredonia's had the same thing.
All your
so,
friends?
well, them too, and they're dead now. So it makes you wonder.
Where were they when it
They was outside working the sawmill, stacking lumber. But all the ones that seemed like they got that was outside, working in the open. I know, and then herding sheep, boy, you're always out in the open.
My husband just seemed to get weaker and didn't have any strength, and when he got to the point where he couldn't lift a bale of hay without resting, why, he decided to go to the doctor. He had bragged about never having a headache or toothache and wasn't going to give up very easy. And the doctor told him anywhere from 6 months to 2 years at the most. But my husband said, well, if that's for an ordinary individual, I'll be around in about 15 years from now. Give me 15 years. But at that point, from that point, it was 6.5 years before he died.
I still wasn't totally persuaded about the truth or validity of what they were saying until I went to Las Vegas to interview the Atomic Energy Commission people. When I got to Las Vegas, where the AEC maintained its big public relations office, they gave me a lot of press releases, and they assured me that everything was all right, and that, yes, there were these tests, but they weren't really going to hurt anybody, and that there was no real danger to anybody. And then I went to talk to an official of the Public Health Service, and he indicated to me, without being very specific, that there had been a report which he had helped prepare as a responsible official of the Public Health Service, which had criticized the Atomic Energy Commission and the way in which they had been conducting the tests and the way in which they had been monitoring the tests. And that he personally felt that the health of the people in southern Utah had been threatened by the Atomic Energy Commission. Well, I asked him if he had a copy of the report, And he said he did, but that it was classified. And I don't know whether he was inviting me to look at that report or not inviting me. But in any case, he walked out of his office, and I promptly got up and locked the office door and went through his desk and found the report. And to my astonishment and disgust and horror, I discovered that everything I had been told by the editor of the small-town paper and by those people living out in those ranches was verified by the Public Health Service. And in fact, there was more detail.
The only precaution I remember of them taking was after one blast, they stopped all the cars coming through St. George and at a service station and hosed them off before they let them go on north.
That must have scared you.
Well, it made us all pretty nervous.
What'd you do?
Well, we didn't do anything. What could we do? We were really nothing more than guinea pigs.
Actually, when the invisible cloud had passed, the total amount of radiation deposited on St. George was far from hazardous. Then you may ask, why were the people asked to stay indoors? For a very simple reason. The Atomic Energy Commission doesn't take chances on safety. It is the AEC's policy to keep to a minimum any exposure of persons to radiation.
Max, what did the doctor tell you?
Well, he told me I had myelogenic leukemia and that he could give me some medicine that'd get me a-going, you know. And then finally, after I'd went a year or so to him, I finally asked him just how long people with this generally live, and he said, well, the average is 5 years, some longer and some less. Just depends. So I've had it just exactly 3 years now.
What's it feel like?
Well, when your white count gets cleared up to over 250,000, why, you just get so limber, you just ain't there, you know. So, see, 8,000's normal.
Yeah.
And when it gets starting to get up over 100,000, why, you start to getting just a little rum-dum. And you just don't have the vinegar to do anything. So, you can always tell when it starts to going up on account of the way you feel.
Right.
And if you happen to cut your finger, if you want to really tell, just cut your finger and look at the blood that comes out. It's pink and watery. You know damn well you're in bad shape.
Did the government ever give you any warning or tell you there might be dangerous?
No, none whatever.
Has the government made any attempt to communicate with you that it might have been dangerous in all this time, or follow up
Nothing.
tests?
No, not that I know of, not that I'm aware of.
When the tests were being conducted, one after the other, they would monitor where the radiation clouds were going.
In 1979, 235 people downwind from the test site sued the government for cancers and deaths caused by radiation.
In St. George, which is known to be now, and it's admitted in the documents, to be the most radiated place probably in the world, because time after time when the wind was right, the test would be set off at the Nevada test site, and then they would plot the fallout as it would go through the southern Utah area, and it was all documented.
Over a period of 8 years, the people of southern Utah were exposed to atomic fallout from the weapons tests. The United States government initiated health studies. Although it knew radiation-induced cancers can take from 20 to 30 years to show up, no study ever received government funds for that length of time.
I'd like to know more about what low-level exposure does to the thyroid specifically, but to maybe other organs as well. Mm-hmm. I'd like to follow them for as long as I possibly could. 30 years would be probably an ideal period of time to say aim for.
And they were allowed to get sick and to grow sick, and no one bothered to check up on them. No one bothered to keep contact with them, and no one bothered to test them. That was all too much trouble. And the fact is that when the commission, and the records show this very clearly, that when the commission people considered this question, They always took into account, well, what was the public relations effect going to be? They were so concerned about the public relations aspect of it that they were doing everything, including suppressing information, lying, evading the truth, in order to cover up the reality of the dangers.
Every administration since Truman's has either classified or withheld information from the public about the health hazards of low-level radiation.
This is The Big Picture, an official television report of the United States Army, produced for the armed forces and the American people.
Control of the land has been indispensable to victory in war throughout the history of man and his struggles. Control of the land he lives on and from which he derives his sustenance. Yes, even today, in the age of the atom, that fact remains. The battlefield of the future, if it exists, may well be an atomic battlefield. That brutal fact has forced upon the Army the absolute necessity of testing both men and technical concepts under atomic conditions.
We was risen out of our bunks about 5 o'clock in the morning, told that we was going to be prepared for an H-bomb blast test. We was put in trucks and rolled down to the sites. We was told to then get out of the trucks and find a hole. This is what we did in a hurry.
Before every test, the participating soldiers have been fully and carefully briefed on the nature of the A-bomb. They have learned from authoritative sources the bomb's power and capabilities, the effects at various distances of heat, blast, and radiation. They have learned what exposure can do to an unprotected individual. But along with this, they learn also how various kinds of shelter, including the soldier's foxhole, can give protection. This kind of information, based on fact rather than uninformed hearsay, goes a long way toward dispelling unreasoning fear.
The men were stationed 5,500 yards from ground zero. They were in trenches. The trenches collapsed. Dirt, dust, and debris was blowing around. There was a hot wind, or very hot wind. Trees and shrubbery caught fire. The men could see the bones in their arms when they shielded their eyes.
Heavy silence hangs over ground zero, the target area, and the trenches in which the soldiers wait. The countdown announces the detonation. Men who have experienced their first atomic explosion, moving out of their trenches toward the blast area with the mushroom cloud still hanging in the air, have acquired an invaluable first-hand knowledge of the effect of nuclear devices.
I flew cloud sampling missions, and later on participated in flying a drop test mission. Well, I retired from the Air Force in 1963, and approximately 8 months later, I had a severe, what I thought was a toothache. However, it was diagnosed as cancer.
I believe, having talked to some of the participants much later, felt that it was a perfectly natural kind of combat exercise not all that different, really, from the kind of combat exercise that soldiers go through in general training.
How you feeling?
Not too bad.
Could you describe what you saw and felt at that time?
We sat up on an open hillside, and just before the blast was detonated, they had us turn our backs towards it and put our hands over our eyes. Of course, when they detonated a bomb, and we could see every bone in their fingers, hands, and what have you. Right through the skull, close the eyelids. And just like taking a large x-ray.
Was there heat?
That's from the bright light, the heat.
When the blast went off, I was blown out of the hole that I was in. And I was hurt pretty bad.
I think national security demanded what was done. I think the Army did the proper thing. Now, I will also say that as the years went on, we got more and more careful, and we knew more and more. I would say in 1957, we did things better than we did in 1955, and better in 55 than we did in 53.
Did they give you any kind of dosimeters or any other equipment, protective equipment?
A laboratory film bag, which we finally or they emitted here on the 5th of August this year. They wasn't no good.
Yeah.
They wouldn't show the fallout or the dust we was kicking off the ground.
Well, I'm afraid safety was not very much a factor. And I think there was great concern about presenting a film to the public, and they filmed some of this, to show them that they could do this without any fear, that they could operate in the atomic age with the bombs and run troops right in there, probably to reassure the soldiers.
What seems to be the trouble, soldier? You look a little bit worried.
Well, I am, Chaplain. Just a little bit.
Actually, there's no need to be worried, as the Army has taken all of the necessary precautions to see that we're perfectly safe here. First of all, one sees a very, very bright light, followed by a shock wave, and then you hear the sound of the blast, and then you look up and you see the fireball as it ascends up into the heavens. It contains all of the rich colors of the rainbow, and then as it rises up into the atmosphere, assembles into the mushroom. It's a wonderful sight to behold.
Preliminary results of a U.S. government study of the soldiers at the test site shows an abnormally high incidence of leukemia. The government has denied the connection between the illness and the tests. They say, prove it.
So this particular night I stayed, and they brought in a small yellow panel truck, and they left one man with a flashlight at the service road and proceeded down towards the tower, the test area, at the 2,500-yard perimeter, and led them out of the truck. I saw what Major Skirker claims was a volunteer officer. And he was bleeding from the nose, and the mouth, and the eyes, and he had managed to crawl behind a bunker. There was wires hanging off of him. The ground was hot enough, it burnt the bottom of my boots. I remember a camera that was pointing at the bunker and not at the tower. I was picked up by two men in protective clothing. They ripped my film badge from me. A civilian cursed as he did so. I was given a shower, which they say decontaminated me. They drew blood, and they called Camp Deseret, Nevada, and notified him that I was being held for medical observation. I was gone for a week. But the funniest thing, I didn't see a doctor. The guy I talked to was a psychiatrist, the first one. And the medication, I drank. the second time, I wouldn't take the medication because I found myself to the point where I didn't know my rear end from my nose.
Jim O'Connor, a non-com, says he was less than 2 miles from Ground Zero at a test called Turk 2. The Army says only volunteer officers were that close. But Jim Gates, a sergeant, says his unit was ordered there.
My company was a mile, like most of us was. The majority of us was. 'Cause, man, I mean, we dug holes almost all the way to Mexico, you know, trenches, see, and it was a horrible sight after it was all over, you know.
What was the sight?
Blood, people hollering, screaming. A whole lot of men got hurt in this thing, man. Some of them is not even living today, behind 23 years.
What's your reaction to what's been happening?
Well, I think it's a very poor situation. I think the Pentagon has been doing a lot of covering up over the years.
Covering up of what?
Stuff like this that's been happening. See, they don't want to admit that it's happened to us.
That man's got no more reason to be here. The reason he's here is because he trusted people in whom he had no basis for given that kind of trust. And all cancer patients who use morphine learn very quickly that either that or a lot of pain. And that choice is a fairly easy one. The danger is to get it. There is a possibility of getting addicted to the morphine. And one has to be careful of that.
Do you feel any bitterness that you may have picked it up covering these stories?
Sure. Sure, I feel bitter. I could even pinpoint, in a way, the possibility of when I got that. I went out looking for the story, and the story included a phenomenon which was called the hot spot, in which there would be a concentration in a small area of very highly concentrated radioactivity. Well, I remember being out in the hills, back of the test site, and in the area where the fallout was, with a Geiger counter, and looking, just wandering around. And I hit some of those hot spots. I knew I hit the hot spots because the Geiger counter went right off the scale and went onto a different scale. And the assumption is that there's a good possibility that at some point at one of those hot spots, I picked up a radioactive, infinitely small particle, or a radioactive isotope which lodged in my lung.
Now, plutonium tends to be breathed into the lung, and it tends to just land right there, down at the terminal airway here. And it stays there for many years. And remember the alpha particle being given off? And it only goes a very short distance, and it only irradiates these cells. All the rest of the lungs get nothing. And you don't know you've got plutonium inside you. And what's more, we can't tell if you've got an atom or a couple of atoms of plutonium in your lung. And one day, instead of the cell just dividing in a regulated way to produce 2 daughter cells, which cells normally do, it goes berserk because the regulatory gene has been damaged, and it produces millions of daughter cells, and that's a cancer.
And then it spread from my lungs throughout my whole body, into my bones, and in my spine, and in my ribs, and in my hip, where it is most painful now. And I don't know where next, and I don't know for how long.
Since you got the cancer, you got more mellow, but it's also made you more determined in a sense. Yes, it's made me very much more determined for one reason that
that I didn't know about before, one thing I didn't understand before. I was filming Elmer Jackson, the way you people are filming me. I was talking to Elmer Jackson while he was up on his horse. And he had to get down off the horse a couple of times because he couldn't take the pain.
And so I went into my home, and my wife met me at the door, and she says, "Heavens, what's the matter with your face and your eyes?" And I said, "Well, I was just in that atomic fallout that was caused from the blast this morning in Nevada." And she said, "Well, your eyes look terrible and your face is all blistered."
I didn't know what he meant by the kind of pain that comes from radiation and the nausea that comes from chemotherapy. That was just words to me. It didn't really have any significance.
I had a large growth on my neck, seemingly came overnight, and was about the size of an egg.
I have the pain now. I know what that pain is like. Now I know how Elmer felt.
Saul, if you're in so much pain, why do you keep working?
Well, that is a saying in the Talmud that has been a motto for me for most of my adult life. It's not incumbent upon thee to complete the task, but neither art thou free to desist from thy part of it. I take that to mean that I'm a descendant of a long line of social activists and social critics and people, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, hundreds of years, thousands of years before I ever came into existence. And that long after I'm dead, there'll be people doing the same kind of work that I'm doing. And my job is to do my piece of it. Maybe it's a little piece, maybe it's a big piece, but somehow you got to do your piece of it. Otherwise, there's no significance in living, at least not for me.
Let the word go out that the murder machine must be dismantled, and that we will be back here and elsewhere, again and again, again and again, again and again, until this lunacy is ended and the war machine is permanently dismantled.
The target of the demonstrators is the Rocky Flats plant, where the triggers are made for plutonium bombs.
They process a lot of plutonium metal, and about 6 ounces of this metal in very fine dust goes up the exhaust stacks every day, and this then is removed by filter banks in large part, but not all of it, because some does escape in plumes or smoke from the exhaust stacks from the plant. And this is all upwind from the Denver metropolitan area.
After 25 years of operation, over 200 accidents, including 2 major fires, have occurred at the Rocky Flats plant. Soil samples from the plant area by Dr. Johnson showed levels of plutonium hundreds of times higher than the normal background level.
We had our litter of pigs born that was deformed. Some of them were, dead, never even. And yet, when the EPA took some of those and run tests on them, they found plutonium in them, in those dead pigs. Now, they can't be breathing that. This means the sow had to pick it up in order to transfer it into those pigs that were born. Yet the state took one of those pigs, and they claim they found nothing in it. Yet the EPA is finding this stuff.
What happened to you?
Well, I had tumors on my chest. I had them taken off a year ago. They took off 8 of them. And the health department, state health department, took 4 of them, and the EPA took 4. Carl Johnson took them for the EPA. Well, the state health department found nothing, but the EPA found plutonium, thorium, and some uranium in these tumors that was taken off my chest.
Where do you think the plutonium came from?
The only place it could have come from, in my opinion, is the Rocky Flats. Because we get the wind here, we've had wind clocks at 118 miles an hour from here. We're right straight east of it.
Plutonium is the most toxic substance, really, that we know, most carcinogenic substance, and lasts for 500,000 years and is not biodegradable. Plutonium is so poisonous that if you took a pound of it, and you theoretically could put a little piece in every person's lung on Earth, you could give every man, woman, and child lung cancer, 1 pound. And each nuclear reactor, a big one, makes 500 pounds of it a year.
The contamination of these private lands around the plant is due to fires. There have been a number of fires which have released plutonium. A major one occurred in 1957. In one day, and this was 8 days following the fire, enough plutonium was released to exceed 50 years limits. This was exceeded in a single day. In addition, the Rocky Flats plant stored several thousand barrels of lathe oil contaminated with metal millings of plutonium. These barrels corroded, the oil ran about the soil, and this is blown all over an area over 20 square miles in size. In addition, they have burned over 1,000 barrels of contaminated lathe oil in an open ditch. These studies, which are still preliminary, have shown more than twice as much lung cancer and leukemia in a population of 86,000 people near the plant, compared to another area in the south part of the county with 97,000 people, but without such contamination.
At this point in time, he has no data which would substantiate there is any health hazard associated with Rocky Flats or radiation in this particular environment.
He thinks that it's wrong to inform the public in such a manner that they're alarmed about contamination by the plant. For my part, I think this aspect is secondary to the public's need to be informed about the hazards of such contamination.
I think as a society, in every endeavor, we've made mistakes. In the area of radiation, certainly in the medical field, we've given people radiographs that perhaps didn't need to be given. We've had experiments in Nevada that perhaps could have been done differently. The barrel storage incident at Rocky Flats that we were talking about previously may not have occurred. And therefore, we look back at those things and say, let's not let them happen again. They were done under the contingencies of the time. And therefore, I'm not sure we can call them mistakes, but things that we would do differently by virtue of more information at this time.
What about the workers? Haven't studies shown a higher incidence of cancer among them?
There have been, over the 30 years the plant has been in existence, several individuals exposed to plutonium, and they do contain that material in their body. There are a few people who contain material above what are now set as the limiting values. The studies on these individuals and other employees at other plants have shown no deleterious effects with regard to their health, their welfare, their earning capability, and their outlook on life.
I've been here 10 years. Nothing's happened to me yet, but...
But you think the yard is important for the neighborhood?
Oh, yeah, very. It's my bread and butter right now.
Thank you.
These nuclear power workers are inhaling and swallowing radionuclides from the nuclear power, and the stuff gets into their body and into their organs, where it just irradiates just a few cells for many, many years with quite a high dose, whereas the whole body gets a low dose. But those cells affected get a high dose, and one day the man gets leukemia or cancer.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it. No, I don't believe it.
He had never been sick. I mean, he was never sick in his life that I recall, other than the flu. And then this was just a matter of 2 or 3 days, and then in the hospital on Friday and died on Saturday. And he did say he was working on a hot boat, which meant that had a leak in the reactor room.
I don't feel radiation safe at all. Why do I work there? I worked there for same reason probably 95% of the people work over there. They're working for the bucks.
Only there for a short time sometimes. You don't pick up that much.
They tell us it's safe. Who knows, though?
Radiation is a hazard. We know that. And the feeling is that while the levels set for occupational exposure are considered safe, the people are knowingly taking what additional risk there may be to work in that industry or associated with it.
I was in pretty bad shape, so they rushed me down to VA over in Jamaica. When I got there, they found out how critical it was. I didn't have any white cells. And right off...
What do you have? What's wrong?
Well, I had leukemia, hairline leukemia, and...
You had to do it over again. If you had known what this was, would you do it?
Never. Knowing that the outcome could be this way. I mean, and knowing what radiation is, the average guy was a number there. I mean, they never stressed it that you could get sterile. There was no stress that it would be cancer. There was never stress that you would get leukemia and die within time. There was no fringe benefits on the job. It was a job. We thought we had to do it, and we were proud to do it. But now that this has come through and we find out that radiation is bad for everybody, how much? Who's to say? I mean, some can take a little dose of poison and live, and others take a drop and they're gone. Radiation, if your body is weak and run down, and if you got a cut and he doesn't have a cut, you get it in your system, it doesn't come out. Radiation is a lot more than, well, from what I know now and what little I've learned about it, it's a bad thing.
A study of the death records of Portsmouth and a comparative population by Dr. Thomas Najarian of Boston has shown that Portsmouth nuclear workers suffer 4.5 times as many leukemia deaths as the general population. The Navy refused to cooperate with Dr. Najarian's study, then denounced his results, and finally declared it would do its own study. At the government's Hanford, Washington nuclear facility, the AEC commissioned a health study of its workers. It awarded the study to University of Pittsburgh scientist Dr. Thomas Mancuso.
Ours was the only study which measured and determined what happened to the workers who left the employment 10, 20 years later and traced them all over the country.
You might think that we'd said stop the industry instantly. All we have said in rather small, quiet, scientific voice is
there are more radiation-induced cancers than anyone recognized before, and they can be caused by low-level radiation.
Dr. Mancuso's study showed that there were radiation-induced cancers among the Hanford nuclear workers. The Department of Energy defunded the study, a tactic used before.
Both the Atomic Energy Commission and the laboratory wanted me and my colleague Goffman to be silent and to not express our views on the biological effects of radiation publicly. At that time, I had a group of 13 people, and my group was eliminated, and I became a non-person at the laboratory.
I was amazed at the way they handled the Mancuso contract. This was a scientist who was doing the research, and it happened to be showing that there was some adverse effects from low-level radiation on employees. Well, someone didn't like that in the Department of Energy. So they simply take the contract from him and give it to a company that's involved with the nuclear operation.
We started those studies with Dr. Mancuso, and 14 years later we get the first results. That's quite an investment, and so we moved the program because we felt that the rate of progress was not adequate to the needs.
They didn't want to have a study to show that low-level radiation was affecting the health of their employees.
The government should be responsible. I mean, everybody isn't going to benefit by it like in the service. A man went in the service, the ones that got the Purple Heart, they get compensation. They get men that, us fellows that come out all right, we don't expect anything. But in the Navy, when you work on radiation and people that got involved and got hurt by it or affected by it, it's not more than right that the government should kind of make amendment for it.
Would that be feasible?
To lower the standards? Yes, I think that it's feasible. I would hesitate to come up with a precise number because I think that the evidence now says that the standards are safe.
As far as radiation, it's pretty ticklish for the simple reason, like they say, if they admit they're wrong to one, it's going to involve millions and millions, and the government isn't in a position, I believe, out now to say they were to blame. No way will they try to admit it. And we know, and Rickover even stated himself in an article in the paper stating that the dosimeters and film badges weren't up to what they should be.
Why won't they lower the standards?
Well, they won't lower the standards because it means that the nuclear power industry will be threatened, may have to go out of existence. It will have to mean that the governmental policy was wrong in the first place. It will mean, therefore, that compensation suits, which will occur anyhow, are more creditable, and it means that the government officials have had wrong advice and have used poor judgment for years.
I told you about in 1957 how I used this report that they had classified. In 1971, I was writing another story, and I asked them for a copy of that report. I asked them to declassify the report for me and give it to me. And this time I would use it legally. They declassified it. They gave it to me, but they gave it to me with a page missing. And the page that was missing was the page which said there ought to be a continuous health study of the people done. And it was perfectly obvious why they left that page out when they gave it to me, because they've done nothing since 1957, and they've decided that the best way to make certain that no one knows they've done nothing was to leave out of the report that section which was relevant to that question.
What did they say when you asked them about it?
They said, well, I guess we made a mistake. The mistake was that they didn't know that I still had a copy of the original report.
The government's response to studies like Dr. Mancuso's, which are critical of radiation standards, is to call for even more studies, which may take years to complete. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Americans continue to be exposed to what many experts believe are harmful doses of radiation.
If we want that kind of energy, if we want those kind of weapons, we're going to have to pay for it in the future. And it isn't us, actually, that'll pay for it as much as it is our descendants, our great-great-grandchildren. They may have the greatest problem with what to do with all this nuclear waste and what to do with all the defective offspring that may be a result of all this spreading out of radioactive material. And everybody in the world has some plutonium in their tissues now. And my concern is that this does get to the gonads, that is, the testicles and the ovaries, and it may, when it gets there, cause genetic troubles in the next generation.
This is Seabrook, New Hampshire, where a nuclear power plant is being constructed, despite the fact that a majority of the people of Seabrook voted against it. Seabrook is just one of the many places where the spread of nuclear power has met with local resistance.
I and many other people can't see any good coming out of it, but just bad. Then it's our duty, by the New Hampshire Constitution, to do something about it.
I am in favor of what the federal government has issued and nothing more, and I will continue to support the enforcement of the federal regulations, and I do not see any necessity of creating regulations that would harass and deter the forward movement of the nuclear age that is now upon us.
Get out of here, you'll be arrested too.
My name's Brian Cullen.
I know who you are, Brian. Come on now, get up. Come on.
I don't want to make it hard.
Get up.
There's absolutely no reason at all to delay relative to reducing the standards. This is the action that should be taken now. It would be criminal negligence, as far as I'm concerned, to allow the people to be continuously exposed now, when we do know that there is this real probability that low-level ionizing radiation does cause cancer.
I've thought a lot of times, why in the hell did it have to happen to me?
Why couldn't it happen to Joe Blow? But I guess he wants to get by as bad as I do, you know.
Sometimes I'd like to take a poke at somebody. I don't know who.
Yeah.
In my mind, right now, the standards are adequate to ensure public health and safety.
These men had these ideas that it wasn't hurting anybody, and they didn't want anybody to declare them differently, I think, is the whole thing. They didn't want to be made fools of.
I said there's no correlation between radiation and disease you got. And that's ridiculous.
What the nuclear physicists are saying is that in order to have energy eternally, we have to make a bargain with the devil. We can't have energy without that bargain. And the bargain for them is a simple one. Price is a very high price. The danger and the threat of nuclear catastrophe is always there. And they think it's worth it if they have to make a choice.
Some fine people have stepped out of the nuclear industry and said, we were wrong, we shouldn't have done it, we should stop it. But most of the people in it can't say, my whole life up to now has been a mistake. It's a very hard thing for anybody to say.
We're clearly going to continue to have nuclear for a long time, whether we use it for energy or not. Our national security program is based in a major way on nuclear weapons, as is that of many countries in the world. And that's going to be around.
They believe that they are the guardians of the future of America. And therefore, they have the right to make certain kinds of decisions for everybody else without necessarily consulting with everybody else. Then they get a bureaucratic interest, a vested interest in the operation. They get bigger and bigger staffs, and they get more and more money to do their research, and they get more and more prestige. And before you know it, they're totally committed. And they've forgotten what science is all about. And they've forgotten the social purposes of science. And no one raised the question, who says we have to have nuclear energy? No one raised the question of whether the public might be willing to cut back on energy in other forms and do without that Faustian bargain, not run the kind of risks that we're running now, that we see are turning out to be enormously increased numbers of cancers. All the predictions that the nuclear scientists who supported nuclear energy turning out to be not true. Not true. They kept insisting there was no danger from low-level radiation. Turns out there's serious dangers from low-level radiation. They kept predicting that the problem of nuclear waste would be solved. It hasn't been solved at all. And it doesn't seem to be any solution in sight. They kept predicting that human beings wouldn't be adversely affected, except in the case of a large-scale nuclear disaster, and that couldn't happen. Turns out human beings are affected. It also turns out now that a large-scale nuclear disaster can take place.
What do you want finally said about this story?
What I want finally said about this story is that since 1946, when the Atomic Energy Commission was created, until 1977 and 1978, when the Atomic Energy Commission is now part of the Department of Energy, it has operated in exactly the same fashion. It has attempted to operate in exactly the same fashion by keeping the truth from the public, by being so committed to the spread and use of nuclear energy that it's willing to do anything to continue with that, and by having the notion that the people inside that agency are somehow given themselves the right to make decisions that affect the rest of the world without any check by the rest of the world on what they're doing. And that has to stop. That whatever changes have been made over the past 20 years in the operations of that agency, and there have been some changes. There's no doubt it's better now to deal, we're in a better position than we were. There's not as much secrecy. You can't use the classification system. They're more open. There's more regulation. Whatever changes have been made because we've been fighting for those. But we've got a long, long way to go. And that's what I would like to see happen.
Paul Jacobs died on January the 3rd, 1978. He was 59.